today is the day. I'm so excited. We're going to take the artwork that we created in last week's video, and I'll pop a link on screen if you missed that, and we're going to take it from Procreate. We're going to add it to a template that I've created for you. It's totally free. It's a Procreate file that you can use and reuse multiple times to create any 4x6 greeting card. I'm going to show you how to take that artwork, put it on the greeting card. We're going to walk through how to do test prints. I've got a really, I think, unique process on how I do that, and it'll save ink and paper, which is always nice. And then we're going to run an actual watercolor, a sheet of watercolor paper through my little home printer over there. So I'm going to show you how that process works. And then I've got a really cool embellishment to share. I'm going to show you how to create a watercolor effect without using any watercolor at all. So lots of really fun stuff in this video. So we need to hop into Procreate first, get our file all ready to go, and then we'll take it offline and have some fun. Here's our artwork from last week's video, and now we're going to get ready to do some test prints. We need to export this artwork, so I'm going to come over to the wrench, go to share, and you can either export as a PSD or a TIFF. Either one of those is fine. I'm going to choose TIFF, and I'm just going to save the image to my camera roll. Now we're going to create a brand new canvas. If you'll remember, we created this in the Display P3 color profile. It allows us to have a wider gamut of colors. That way, when they're reduced down, when it goes to your home printer, you can still take advantage of colors that your printer can achieve. So that is why I personally recommend the Display P3 for printing at home. You might surprise yourself at some of the colors that your home printer can actually achieve. I'm going to create that brand new canvas. It's going to be letter size, so 8.5 by 11 landscape and 300 DPI Display P3 color profile. Here's that canvas, and if I go into canvas and canvas information, I just want you to be able to see this. So dimensions, 11 inches by 8.5, so it's landscape. 300 DPI color profile is Display P3. And what we're going to do is go to the Add category, insert a photo, and grab the exported TIFF that we just added to our camera roll. Here that is, and because it's 4x6, you can see it's smaller on this canvas, but we're going to reduce it down in size. I want to make it small enough so I can get 3 across and then 3 down, so we can do 6 different variations of this for our test prints. So that feels like a pretty good size. So this is going to be called our original. So I'm going to name this original. So now I'm going to do variations of this so we can see if we add a little more darkness or lightness to our colors, how that's going to be interpreted when it comes out of the printer. Is it going to look better or worse? So I'm going to duplicate our original, and I'm going to slide it over. So down here, make sure your magnetics and snapping are on. That way it's easy to drag it straight across. And then this is our original. I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to change the blend mode. For these top 2, I'm going to do lighter versions, and then the bottom 3, I'm going to do darker versions. So first I'm going to start with an overlay. So I have an overlay blend mode on top of a normal blend mode, and you can see that it kind of lightens everything up, but it also kind of washes it out. So I want to reduce the intensity of this overlay blend mode. In order to do that, you're going to drag your opacity down, and I'm going to drag mine down to about 50% because it is lighter than the original. If I zoom in here, you can see, especially in the flowers, you can see these 2 petals look pretty different. If you want to increase it even more, you can do that. I can see these leaves over here are a little bit lighter. Let's actually up this a little bit more. I'm going to come up to 65%, I think. That way we can see a greater difference when it comes out of the printer. So these ones are much lighter over here than these ones. And I want to make sure that I'm keeping track and making notes to myself about the settings that I'm going to be using for these. So I'm going to create a brand new layer. I've got black selected, and you can just grab any brush you want. I still have my Tuesday water brush selected, so I'm just going to use that. So I'm going to say I've added an overlay blend mode at 65% opacity. So that's how I kind of tell myself what I've done. And then I can group these together, and this is going to be number 2. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this, zoom out, drag it over. All right, I can clear my note on this one. We're going to make a new note, and then I'm going to change this opacity all the way up to 100 again, and now we're going to experiment with a different blend mode. So this is a 100% overlay right now. Let's try a soft light because we're trying out some lighter variations. You can kind of compare some of the areas. It can be helpful to look at some of the darker areas like this leaf over here this leaf over here. Everything's a little bit softer. It's soft light and a little bit lighter. So this one's at 100% soft light. So I'll add that as my note for this one, plus a soft light layer at 100%. And that's all set, and we can label this one number 3. I'm going to duplicate this one. We'll drag it over here, drag it down. Make sure I still have enough space where I can see everything. And open this one up. We're going to clear my note. And then on this variable layer, I guess, we always have the original at normal, 100% normal opacity. This is the one that we're changing each time to influence the saturation, the contrast, and the brightness. So now let's do some darker variations. I always begin with multiply. I always really like this setting, especially on my home printer, but at 100%, it's definitely too dark and too intense. So I'm going to bring this one down to about 50%. And you can see compared to the original one, we're going to have some kind of difference when it comes out of the printer. So in my notes, I'm going to label this one plus multiply at 50%. We can label this group number 4, duplicate it, and drag it over. You can see that this part's covering up my note. I made my wreaths just a little too big here. So let's just universally reduce the size of all of them. So I've got a little more space, and I'll save on some ink too. And now I can grab my 4 groups and drag them down a little bit. There we go. All right, so on my brand new group, I'm going to clear my note and change this one all the way up to 100. And let's pick a different dark blend mode. So the next one that I've chosen is a linear burn. So come down here. It behaves in a dark way like multiply does, but it's quite a bit more intense. So I wanted to see how the printer would interpret that. But obviously this one's way out of control. And the one that I've been playing around with is like 40 to 45%. So I want it to be different than the multiply. So maybe we'll come up to 45%, so it'll be really obvious. You can see how dark these are getting. So let's go to our notes layer, and I'll say plus linear burn at 45%. All right, last one. Change this one to number 5, duplicate, drag it over. We'll clear our notes layer. Make sure this one's all the way back up to 100, and now we'll choose another blend mode. So the last one I've chosen is color burn for this. So this one's right above linear burn. And this one's kind of got like a dark intensity, like high contrast, but there's also a little bit of lightness too. So it's another really good one to include in your test prints, just as a comparison to how it behaves. You can see already, I've got a lot of yellows popping out, whereas these ones are definitely more in the red, pink area. So, variation is really good right here because we want to see what the printer can do. And for this one, I've chosen 65%. So we want to make sure that it still looks different than the other ones. And from far away, I can tell I definitely have more yellow around this part. I could even, let's bring it up to 70 so it is super obvious. And then I'll just label this one as color burn at 70%. We have all of these all set. Let me label this one number 6, and I also think I'm going to reduce the size one more time of these just to save on some ink and to make sure nothing gets cropped off. So that's good. Let's go get our watercolor paper ready now, and then we can print this. Before we can send our watercolor papers through the home printer, we need to cut it down to size. So I have this Canson cold press watercolor paper. It's 140 pounds. And it's size 9 by 12. So I need to cut this down so it's a letter size paper, since that's the size that I've selected for the template. I'm going to take 2 of them out because we need one for our test prints and we need one for our final card. So I've got 2 out of here, and then I'm going to follow the same process for each one of these. You want to find the side that you're going to be printing on, and that's going to be the rougher texture, whatever paper you end up choosing. If you choose to do watercolor paper like I am, there's going to be a smooth side and there's going to be a side that's got a little bit more texture. So the texture side is the side that you want to carry ink. That's the side that your design is going to be printed on. So when I'm making cuts, I always make sure I make my marks on the smooth side. And in order to do this, I find the short side first. I've got pencil. This is a cork-backed ruler. It's my favorite type of ruler because it stays steady on here. It's a lot better than one that doesn't have the cork. And then I use a utility knife. You can use an X-Acto if you'd like. This one is just, I think, more sturdy and stable when I'm making cuts. So all I'm going to do is measure out 8.5 on this side. And then I'll do the same thing down here. Line those two marks up. I put a brand new blade in here, so it'll be super sharp, so I won't have to go over it a bunch of times. Move that off to the side, and now we can do our long side. So I'm still on the smooth side of the paper, and I will measure 11 this time on the long side. All right, close your utility knife. Now this sheet is ready to send through the printer. It's 8.5 by 11, so it's my letter size paper. And I'm going to repeat the exact same steps for this sheet of paper. One of them will be used for the test prints, and then from the test prints, we'll decide which settings we want to go with, and then the other sheet will be used for our final card. So I'm going to cut this one down now, and then we'll hop back into Procreate to send our test print template through the printer, and we'll take a look at what our test prints look like. We're back where we left off in Procreate, so now let's send it to the printer. What you want to do is come to your wrench, you want to go to share, and once again I'm going to choose TIFF. This time I'm going to choose print. I print to my printer wirelessly, so it makes it a little bit easier, but if you don't have a wireless printer, then you'll have to plug into it, or you can send the TIFF file to your desktop or laptop and print from that too. Nothing says you have to print directly from your iPad. So you want to make sure print and color is selected if you're seeing similar settings for yours. The most important thing is you want letter selected. We're going to be printing on watercolor paper, but we want to see the best possible outcome. That way we get an idea of when our final print is being made, the quality. So the only way to properly do our test print is to print with the exact same settings that we will use when we're doing our final print. So because of that, we need to make sure our print quality is at its best. And for media type, choose photo. Whenever you're creating a high quality print, make sure photo is selected, none of these other ones. So I'm going to toggle back. We've got all of our settings all ready to go, one copy, got my printer, everything's good, we can hit print. Our test print is now complete, so now we get to evaluate which versions look best and which one we would like to move forward with. And I did want to mention, when I put this through the printer, because it is thicker, it's 140 pounds, depending on how your printer works, mine works where it flips it and then it prints it out like this. So I have to make sure that the smooth side is facing up when I put it down here. And I kind of give it a little bit of a head start by just kind of going like this with the paper so it can kind of get used to having to bend as it comes around. That way I don't get any weird creases or ink marks on the textured side. So that's kind of something I always do when I put it through the printer. If I'm looking at these bottom darker ones, I'm kind of like, nope, not going to go with any of these. The color burn is just way too dark and intense. I'm losing a lot of details. Same thing with the linear burn. Linear burn is better than color burn in this situation, but still not as good as the original. And then I do like the multiply, but I am still missing some of the details that I'm getting in the original. So I like the richness that I'm getting from multiply. I could even like bring multiply down to like 15, 20. And I think that that will be a really good middle ground between these two, because this one feels great, but I like the richness of this. So to just bring in a little bit of richness, I can do another test print with multiply at 10 to 20, or I can just, wing it, take my chances and go with it, which I think is what I'm going to do here. And I like the overlay and the soft light, but they just seem just a little too washed out. Like this petal gets really washed out on both of them, and I like that it's a little more obvious here. So personally, I would either go with the original just as it is, or just add a multiply layer that's very subtle. I think I'm gonna go with a 10% multiply just to richen up some of these darker colors. So now let's head back into Procreate. We'll add that adjustment and we're going to set up our final print file, and then we'll add all our embellishments and we'll be done. I'm back in my recording room. So I wanted to kind of show you, now that I've got studio lights around here, the difference between what you see on screen compared to the print. So just for comparison's sake, you should never rely entirely on what you see on screen with how something's going to be reproduced on the printer. You can see how much more desaturated this is. And it's because this is fully relying on CMYK inks mixing, whereas I get the entire light spectrum on screen. So yeah, moral of the story, do test prints. We're going to do exactly what we talked about and get our final print file prepared and ready to go. In order to do this, I'm providing you a free template file, so that is also found in the video description and you can go and download it. I'm going to open it up now. This is what that template looks like, and in the canvas settings, so if I go to canvas information, you can see that this one's also 11 by 8.5, 300, and the color profile is display P3. If you have chosen, or if you're on an older iPad and you don't have access to the display P3, it should default to this sRGB with the 1966 in it, and that's the one that you want to use. If you don't have access to display P3, that is like the next best thing. So just a heads up about that. When you open up this template file in the layers palette, you're going to see a trim and score layer, a bleed layer, and an outline layer, and then the artwork layer. And all of these layers are locked so you don't accidentally shift them or move them while you're playing around with your artwork or positioning your artwork. A bleed area means that is the area, and we're going to talk about this in the next project we do together, but if you have artwork that bleeds beyond your canvas bounds, it's really helpful to have it bleed beyond it, because when you're making these cuts, it allows you to not have to be perfect, so you don't get any like weird white hairlines where your cut happens. If your color extends beyond the canvas bounds, when you trim it, you're going to have a nice clean edge where the ink goes all the way to the edge. The standard bleed size is 1/8 of an inch, so that's what I've put on here. It's just for you to be aware that you can extend it further if you want, but you want to extend it at least that far if you want a clean edge when you're trimming. And then you've got your cut and your score marks, so you can see those. And then I also put in an outline, that way you can kind of see where the fold is happening. So while you're laying out your artwork, you have an idea of where the center will be on each side. So this will be the front of your card, and this will be the back of your card. And before we print it, we don't want to print our bleed guide, and we don't want to print our outline, but we want to print our cut and our score lines. That way when we are cutting out our card, we've got those guidelines to help us. On the artwork layer, I've got that selected. We're going to bring in that TIFF that we exported at the very beginning of this video that we use for our test prints. So I'm going to hit the wrench, add, and insert that TIFF. And if you'll remember, this was a 4x6 size, so it should fit perfectly in our 4x6 side. And this edge, this leaf is a little close to that edge, so I can just tap it over a little bit. I think I would rather have it closer to the score than the cut. So I'm just going to tap it a little bit. And then you can kind of see, does it feel centered? Is it high enough on the page, or is it too low? So now is the time to kind of tap it around and make those adjustments. I think I'm going to tap this up just a couple of times. I think that looks good. This is what I'm going to go with. And now that we've got it positioned, now we can apply those settings that we talked about. And what I've decided to do is duplicate this, change the blend mode to multiply on the duplicate, but reduce this down to 10%, just so I get that extra little bit of contrast. So if I zoom in here, we can kind of see with that extra layer applied before and after. So super subtle. We're almost ready to print. We have to remember, this part's really important, you don't want to waste your print, your ink, or your paper. Always, always make sure you come back to your layer if you're using this template. Turn off, I've noted these, turn off your outline, turn off your bleed. Keep your trim and score. Now it is ready to print, and we can follow the exact same steps that we did before. We're going to come over to the wrench, share, TIFF, come down here and choose print. It may take a second for it to relocate your printer, especially if you're printing wirelessly. Print in color, 1 copy, paper size is letter, media and quality. My printer makes me choose this every single time, so don't just go with whatever the default is. Double check that you have these settings still applied. So I need to move this up to best, change this to photo, and now everything looks good. The paper is in the printer and ready to go, so I'm going to hit print. I've got a few different things here for this last part of cutting it out and embellishing it. You can do as much embellishment or no embellishment if you want, but I wanted to give you some options. So first, let's get this cut out. The first thing I do is line up my score lines. So using my cork-backed ruler, I'll line up those lines. And there are a few things you can use for a score tool. I actually use my utility knife, but instead of the cut side, I flip it over so it's the blunt side of the blade, and then I'll just come through like this. In the past, I've also used a pen that doesn't work anymore, and that also works super well. Or you could use a bone folder, but a bone folder gets a little thick on the end, so that's probably my least favorite. So now I've got a great score line. And then for the cut lines, you just want to make sure that you're not cutting the paper entirely. That's the key here. I just go from the end of one cut line to the end of the other cut line, and that's enough. Because you don't want to cut off your other cut lines, then you won't have your guides for the rest of the cuts. All right, close my blade. Now with our score line, you can just fold it, and now you've got a finished card if you don't want to do any embellishments, and it's all set to go. So if you want to do some embellishments, I want to show you something I kind of discovered by accident the other week, and it's so fun to do. I couldn't stop doing it. So I have a water brush. This is a small water brush, and it's all you need. And if you want to embellish it with more watercolor, you can totally do that. But if all you have is a paintbrush and water on hand, or a water brush, all you have to do is, because there's ink right here on top of watercolor paper, you can just get the tip of your water brush just a little bit wet and then pull some of that color right off, the ink color. So you can do these big splotches of water bleed. And I always clean off my brush, because if I'm using different colors, it's going to dirty the end of my brush tip. So it's up to you how much of this you want to add in. I kind of want to make it feel pretty consistent all the way around. I don't want to go too crazy, but I definitely want this effect. So I want it to be really obvious when someone looks at it that it's supposed to be watercolor. So it's a good way to cheat watercolor without having to paint the whole thing in watercolor. And you'll see that you're going to get some greens and yellows in here, because with an inkjet printer, it combines CMYK to produce the different colors. So it's not going to be as pure as regular watercolor, but I'll show you a way that you can kind of fix that if you want, or you can leave it if you like that effect. It's kind of pretty in some of the areas having that color variation, especially for a fall themed piece. Nice having some of those extra yellows and greens. I try to stay away from the inside of the flower because that's a focal point and I want it to be crisp and clear. And I'm going to add some gold embellishments there anyway. All right, I don't want to stop myself, but it's so fun to do. I'm just going to add a little bit to these berries right here, and then we'll finish it off with some gold. For these areas where you've got a little bit, maybe more color variation than you want, you can go in. I've got, I call it a scrubber brush. I'll leave a link to this along with all of the supplies that are in this video. And it's a much stiffer ended brush, so you got to be careful, because if you scratch too hard, you're going to start destroying the watercolor paper fibers. But as long as it's still wet, if I wet this just a little bit more right here, I can kind of scrub away any hard lines. But once again, you got to be careful. Definitely don't want to do it too hard, but it'll soften some of those up. So once you have your watercolor effects all done, I like adding a little bit of paint splatter at the end, so I'm going to show you how I do that. But first I want to add my gold embellishments. So for this I use Posca markers. So I'll do the medium tip for the lettering and then the fine tip for little details that I want to add in. So let me just get some ink flowing, and I just go over my lettering. So it's kind of like a maroon and a gold mix right here. I kind of like that both of those colors are in there, but they're not super consistent all the way through. Cap that off. And now I'll grab the fine tip one, and I'm just going to add some stippling to the center of my flowers. You can also, if you want to add a little bit more, you can draw over the details that you put in some of the leaves if you want. Just kind of pick and choose what parts you like best that you want to call out a little bit more. And then I'll just put a few dots on these berries to call them out. If you want to add in a little bit of paint splatter, got this little travel Winsor Newton case handy. So I'll just mix up. I'm going to try and get to this more kind of a Payne's gray. If you still have your scraps from when you cut your paper down, you can use them to test out your color. So I think that's a pretty good match with the same leaf colors. So that'll be good for my paint splatter. I would recommend not using your water brush for the paint splatter. So I'm just gonna squeeze out some water right here, and I'll grab one of my other paint brushes. You can use any kind of paintbrush for this. So I'll get my brush nice and wet and then grab the color, and then I can just add a little bit of splatter to it. We can also mix up a little bit of green if you want. All right, let's see what that green looks like. It's a pretty good match, so I'll go with that. We'll let this dry and then I will share the final piece. Our card is all dry now, so that is the finished card on watercolor paper through our home printer, embellished with watercolor details without using any watercolor except for the paint splatter, which is totally optional. And we've got a nice fall card. So that completes our first Procreate Printables project. If you enjoyed this first project, please let me know so I know there's enough interest to keep this series going. Hit the like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, you know the drill. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.